You may not know a ton about the Browns' new offensive line coach, Mike Bloomgren, but there's one thing that's most important for you to know. I'll talk about it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast. I'm proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and, of course, on the road. I don't know if many of you know about the Browns' new offensive line coach, Mike Bloomgren, other than the fact that he was coaching at Rice this past year and got fired, midway through the season. But there's a key thing that you're going to need to know about him in relation to where the Browns are going from here offensively. Speaking of the O-line, it was hard to know if Jack Conklin will be part of the Browns' future beyond this past season. Now I'd say he's pretty indispensable, and how a 3-14 season this past year could impact the decision-making process for Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski this offseason. As always, I want to thank you for being an everydayer and making the Locked On Browns podcast your first listen every day. Of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play just $5. Let's get after it. And yes, the Browns do have a new offensive line coach by the name of, his name is Mike Bloomgren, as I mentioned there in the intro. And if you were sitting there seeing this news come across the ticker or on your phone with a notification, you're not alone in being like, well, who is this guy? I understand why there's not a ton he doesn't come with a ton of recognition, specifically in NFL circles, as to being some guy who's going to be this great coach and turn things around. And so I think there's a little bit of mystery there. I'm here to sort of set the record straight on who he is and tell you one key part of his hire that's maybe the most important. He does have NFL experience, and that alludes to here what the most important part of him being hired means, because he spent time with the Jets from 2007 to 2010. Now, why that is important is because we can essentially call Mike Bloomgren a Bill Callahan disciple, because while he was with the Jets in a handful of different roles, that was the time that Bill Callahan was working with the Jets, 2008 to 2011. So he came there 1 year after Bloomgren was there. And then he stayed 1 year after Bloomgren left to go back to the college ranks. He went to Stanford. And at that time, Bill Callahan was serving as an assistant head coach and an offensive line coach, alongside those Rex Ryan Jets teams that obviously, understanding that Rex Ryan is kind of a goofball now, especially as he's pivoted his career more into being on ESPN. But at the time, Rex Ryan was a coveted coach in the NFL, one of the best defensive minds in the NFL, and was obviously leading the teams in New York that had seen success that they hadn't seen in a long time. And again, Bill Callahan and Mike Bloomgren were both part of those campaigns. Bloomgren was there for the 2 runs to the AFC Championship game. So that to me is the most notable part of this, because yes, we saw how the offensive line took a step back this year when they went away from Bill Callahan and freed him up to go coach with his son, which was the right thing to do. I know some fans have sort of pleaded and said maybe they shouldn't have let him go so easily, and I can understand that, but I think it was about sort of just being a good person. And I get it, like, that doesn't win you football games all the time. But this organization prides itself on doing right by people, and I think it was okay that they let him go. It was just maybe that they didn't find the right replacement for him in Andy Dickerson. And so they bring in Mike Bloomgren, and because he is a Callahan disciple, and I've heard that they actually talked to Bill Callahan about the vacancy and sort of touched base with him on it, and that was part of the conversation here. So I think that's kind of interesting, that I'm assuming since they had a relationship and they worked together, that was probably came, with a pretty decent recommendation from the guy that you obviously had great success here and that you moved on, that you let go. And because you kept that relationship, he was probably willing to give you a good recommendation on somebody. So Bloomgren comes in, and this is interesting because we talked about already the fact that Kevin Stefanski in his press conference after on Sunday after week 18 sort of kept hinting at this idea that they needed to, go back to what they did best. Or he was asked about going back to what they did best and, sort of figuring out their identity. And he was asked about guys in the locker room talking about how they had a lack of identity. And Kevin Stefanski moving on from Ken Dorsey and Andy Dickerson, within 12 hours of the game ending, that week 18 game ending, sort of suggested like, all right, we're going back to the drawing board here. We're pivoting back to what we do best, and we're not just focusing on building a team that's a utopia for Deshaun Watson. And so I do think like finding somebody who comes from the Bill Callahan tree of coaching is a prominent and notable part here. That is what fans, what us in the media clamored for all throughout the season was, or not even necessarily clamored for, but we asked the questions of how much of an impact did Bill Callahan's absence have on this team? And I think we saw that come to fruition with how at times inconsistent the offensive line obviously was. And it became a problem both when Deshaun was out there and throughout other portions of the season. So at this point, it's necessary for them to get back to what they do best, go find that identity, and find an offensive line coach that you think can bring you back to that prominence and comes from the same sort of ilk as Bill Callahan. I think is pretty important. That's a big deal. There's also sort of this undertone, or this sort of side subplot story in relation to Bloomgren and the fact that one of his offensive linemen he was coaching, obviously, that he was coaching this past year. I'm gonna botch this name, but I believe it's Ethan Onianwa, who was one of the best he was a pretty solid offensive tackle for Rice this year. He transferred to Ohio State. And so even though Bloomgren might have not had the success at Rice, he was 2-6 to start the season, which led to his firing. There seems to still be evidence that he was producing quality offensive linemen and still being able to sort of connect with that position group specifically. So I find that as sort of like a subplot here that's kind of interesting. And I also think if you go back to Bloomgren's tenure and his time as a coach, a lot of it in the college ranks, as I alluded to, because he only has that one stint with the Jets to this point in the NFL. But he went to Stanford, and we're talking about like Stanford at the peak of their powers, where they had Andrew Luck and where he was putting out like quality offensive linemen from there. And Stanford was going on and winning, the Pac-12 at the time, helped establish like Christian McCaffrey was there when he was there. I mean, he was at Stanford from 2011, the year after he left the Jets, until 2017, until he got the Rice job in 2018. And so there's something to be said for the fact that like he has experience in some different programs and he has produced what seems like quality offensive linemen who have gone on to the NFL and had success. And obviously also has worked in the NFL closely with a somebody who is held in high esteem in Bill Callahan, and just obviously had so much success with the Browns in the previous couple years. And so it's the latest, I think, step towards the Browns kind of conceding we need to get back to what it is that we do best, and we need to get back to bringing in the right people to get the most out of other position groups, offensive line, the offense as a whole, the quarterback position. Like we're going back to the basics here. We're going back to find that identity, and it starts with the offensive line being able to run this Kevin Stefanski West Coast wide zone play action system that they've had success with and have gotten to the playoffs with 2 times in the last 5 years. And so that's why this hire made a lot of sense. It's hard for me to sit here. Like, I can't sit here and give you like some grade and be like, oh, well, I think this addition gets an A+. Like, I don't even know enough about Mike Bloomgren to give you that. And that kind of comes from asking other people what they know about him. And those be conversations we get to have. But I can't give you that. And I think anybody who's sitting there doing that is kind of silly. I think you just got to kind of use the reference points here and the resume and realize like why this move makes sense. And from that standpoint, I can see and connect the dots on what pushed the Browns to go out and pursue somebody like Bloomgren to come in and run this offensive line room and get it back on track. When you do the math on it all, it makes a ton of sense. And whether or not he's a good offensive line coach or not, I guess we'll find out and see. But I can understand why they pivoted to this being the route that they were going, and they wasted no time doing it, which tells you that they must have had a pretty good recommendation. I mean, there's no connection with Bloomgren and Stefanski otherwise. So the Callahan piece of this is massive. And given how we saw this group progress, I think that's huge as to why they made this move and what it means for the Browns moving forward. When we get back, Jack Conklin, speaking of the offensive line, there were some questions about his future with the Browns beyond this past season, given his injury history and whatnot. But now I would tell you, I think he's pretty indispensable. I'll explain why coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. I've told you guys the story before, but a couple months back, I had a chance to go to the Ohio State, Michigan for the first time. My wife and I had a nice weekend. We went to the game. We had a blast pre-game, during the game, up until the final buzzer sounded, and the Buckeyes, of course, lost for the fourth straight year to the Wolverines. That was disappointing, but one thing I don't regret, one thing that wasn't disappointing, was my ticket buying experience using Gametime. I'll tell you, my ticket buying experience went so smoothly that Gametime has now become my go-to app for buying tickets. Plus, they have a new feature called Gametime Picks, which makes it so much easier to get tickets to your favorite events by allowing you to filter out the fluff. Essentially, it shows you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time? All right, so we talked about the new offensive line coach. I want to stay with the offensive line, though, for a second, because Jack Conklin was a player whose his future with this team, I think, was kind of in question coming into the season, just large for a number and multitude of reasons, maybe. But I do think like some of it just centered around the fact that you had a player who couldn't stay healthy. You had given him the massive extension, and you were sort of banking on him being here long term and being an important piece of this offensive line. But you just didn't know if he was going to stay healthy or not. And you didn't know how he was going to come back and play, most notably after another serious injury in 2023. Well, he finally got back on the field this year. It took some time to get there because he started the season still on that PUP list, and then obviously he came off of it, and he wasn't ready to go for a couple weeks. And then he finally made his debut, a few weeks into the season. And it took him some kind of getting his feet back underneath him. But there were some matchups, against the Steelers where he's matching up against TJ Watt, and you didn't hear TJ Watt's name called throughout either of those two games, really, that they played against Pittsburgh, and some other matchups as well, where Jack Conklin played some fantastic football and was kind of a cornerstone key piece of the offensive line, maybe the key piece of the offensive line. And so because of that, I've done a complete 180 on Jack Conklin, where I kind of thought I'd be going into this offseason talking about, like, how can they get out from this deal? They got to remake this offensive line. And now, because there are so many questions on the offensive line, some of which could potentially be answered by the Bloomgren hire and him being able to, get the most out of this group as a whole and help them get them back to realizing their full potential on offense and in the trenches. But aside from that, though, from like just a talent standpoint, a player standpoint, a personnel standpoint, I am worried about like what this group is going to look like in 2025, because you might have multiple holes to fill. I don't think Jed Wills is coming back. I think that much is pretty much clear at this point. I mean, the Browns basically indicated to you that given how his injury situation played out again this year, I don't think there's a future where Jed Wills is on this team. It was a botched first pick by Andrew Berry, his first pick that he ever made. Hasn't worked out. The injuries have piled up for him. And on top of that, like there's just too much inconsistent play from him to really give him an extension and bring him back after he played out his rookie contract this year. So I think that's a major hole that they might even try to address in the draft. I think left tackle is very much on the table for them in the first round or in a different round. And then we still don't know what Joel Bitonio's future holds. He is going to, take some time to think about it. And he spent the last couple weeks of the season sort of alluding to just how he needs time. He's going to think things through and then come back to the table and figure out what he wants to do. He does have 1 year left on his contract. I'm inclined to believe he's going to come back and finish that last year of his contract. But if he doesn't, he does decide to hang it up. And, he opts for family time and within his right to do so and all those different things to put his football career aside, then, respect it. But that creates yet another hole on the Browns offensive line that they're going to have to fill, because I don't know that Zach Zinter's quite ready to assume that role. So with that in mind, knowing you might have those two spots to fill, I don't know that you can just blindly be like, well, let's get rid of Jack Conklin too and create another problem for ourselves or another hole for ourselves in the offensive line in an offseason where resources are going to be tighter because of the Deshaun Watson contract sort of hanging over your head and restricting a little bit of what you can do, on top of just this being an expensive roster in general. And yeah, you have the draft picks and all that, but you have other needs to address that you can't possibly land, like a starting left tackle, a starting right tackle, a starting guard, maybe a quarterback, a receiver. Like there's so much to do. I just don't know if you want to create another hole for yourself. It's almost like a devil that you know situation. And the biggest thing that worries me about Jack Conklin on this team moving forward is the injuries situation. Like year to year, you just don't know if he's going to make it through a whole season, if he's going to be healthy. But aside from that, like the play is still there. And I think that was the most remarkable thing about his return to the field this season was how well he played. And I pulled this up earlier. His PFF grade, 66.2. It ranked 45th among offensive tackles this year, which maybe isn't, great among his tackle peers, but that 66.2 was the highest grade of any Browns offensive lineman this season, which is telling to how impactful he was and that he kind of was the stable part of this group throughout the season. Joel Bitonio is always pretty stable, and I know Wyatt Teller missed some time with injuries. Like I said, I think Bitonio is still playing at a high level, and I think late in the season, Wyatt Teller got back to playing at a higher level as well, but it took some time to get there, and Conklin was like the sort of steady presence that we all came to kind of understand watching this team. Man, like you didn't hear a lot of opposing pass rushers like wreaking havoc when they were going up against Jack Conklin. So he deserves some credit for that. Before fighting back to play at still a high level and still show that he can be effective. And I do think like he showed you enough that you don't have to think about moving on from him at this point, and you don't have to. And so you bring him back next year, and he is kind of indispensable now on this offensive line group because of potential questions that loom large at other spots along the offensive line. I think that's a key part of this offseason for the Browns, knowing that they have that position at least locked up. And so, yeah, like we'll see how it all shakes out. But I've done a complete 180 on thinking like this might be Jack Conklin's last year here. He's expensive. They got to get out from underneath this contract at some point. They need to get younger on the offensive line and at these positions specifically. But because they're already thinking about getting younger on the left side of the offensive line, you don't really want to mess with a good thing. If Jack Conklin can still play at a high level, he got through the rest of the season healthy. If you know he's going to be back next year to start the season healthy, that's good news for you. And you can kind of feel like you have some stability coming back at least somewhere on that group while you deal with a new offensive line coach, while you still understand like it's an aging group that's going to need that still is going to need some overhauling here in the near future, and that you're probably going to have to start planning ahead on in this upcoming draft and maybe in free agency. So those are all things they have to address moving forward. But there's some assurance in Jack Conklin finishing the season healthy and playing at the level that he was and being the highest graded offensive lineman on this Browns team this year. That's huge. So kind of I don't want to say a surprise, because Jack Conklin was a great tackle at the peak of his powers before all the injuries really started piling up for him here in Cleveland. But a nice sort of, bonus for the Browns that not only is Conklin still playing at a high level, but he made it, not only did he make it through the season healthy and come back from this injury, but he's playing at a high level and now feels like a player that you can depend on rather than have to add to, your list of needs yet another offensive lineman position. So I'm optimistic. I feel good about Jack Conklin's presence here, and it feels good to know that there's at least one part of the offensive line that you don't have to necessarily be panicking about, knowing that the other side has some questions that are kind of looming large as the Browns start their offseason. I do want to talk about, given how a 3-14 season went, given how the season went this year, 3-14, worst record in the Kevin Stefanski era, the pressures that potentially come with it as the Browns make their decisions this offseason, both Andrew Berry, both Kevin Stefanski. What could it mean for where their head is at with that number 2 overall pick? I'll explain coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. It's that time of year. That's right. The playoffs are finally here. And the NFL playoffs are better with our friends at FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same game parlays, and so much more. I'm a big anytime touchdown parlay builder, especially during the playoffs. I also like to try to nail the first touchdown of the game, the first touchdown score of the game during the playoffs. And sometimes I've hit on those and cashed out with some pretty solid money this time of year. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make the playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, so anytime you have a 3-14 season, a 3-win season, it's going to come with some pressure for a coaching staff, for a front office, in terms of the decisions that you're making and, what your job status is going into that next year. And there's been a couple times throughout Kevin Stefanski's tenure where I guess there's been a little more pressure. I think after the 2021 season with Baker Mayfield, or really after the 2022 season with the first year with Deshaun Watson, where, they thought maybe Deshaun wasn't going to be suspended as long as he was, and then he was, and you had a bad year that year. I think it was 7-9, and then you come back the next year, and it's kind of like this clean slate with Deshaun as the starter in 2023, and you're sort of, you get this kind of chance to right some wrongs, and they make the playoffs that year with everybody banged up. The quarterback position is just a revolving door, and you kind of, re-cement like, okay, this coach has still got it. But during that 2022 season, though, I know there were some questions out there, maybe from you, maybe from others, just about how, is Stefanski the right man for the job? And his team regressed after a playoff run in 2021 or in 2020. Like, what does this mean? And all these different things. And now, after a playoff run last year, they've regressed the worst they have under Stefanski's regime and reign, and Andrew Berry's reign as general manager. And so we've done a lot of finger pointing and saying like who's to blame more and whatnot. You at this point know I'm a big Kevin Stefanski supporter. I think he's part of the solution, not the problem here. And when I hear like they're running it back, I was glad that meant mostly I'm glad that meant Stefanski, because I do think Stefanski is a good coach in this league. And maybe that gets proven wrong over the course of the next season or so. But I still believe that Stefanski has this organization headed in the right direction, and that he had some flaws in the way this thing was built, and that they bet on Deshaun Watson and missed, and that set them back this season and maybe for years to come. But I never understood that pairing from the beginning. If you were going to force a square peg into a round hole with Deshaun running Kevin Stefanski's system, I don't get it. And so that to me falls more on GM. That to me falls more on ownership and some of the pressures that it seems like there were to pursue Deshaun Watson in the first place. And because of that, I don't want to say Stefanski's off the hook. Like, it is his team, and he still only produced 3 wins out of it this season. But I cut him a little more slack than I do Andrew Berry in that way. And so as we get ready for the 2025 season, and it starts with these moves they're making now with coaching staff changes, free agency, and then the draft, it almost like this year is going to be a pressure cooker of a season for both Stefanski and Berry. Because here's the thing, like, you go 3-14, You can't possibly go out next year and have a similar record to that in 2025. You have to get back to winning. Andrew Berry just told you on Monday, we're always going to prioritize winning. And whether it's Myles Garrett putting their feet to the fire saying to do it, or it's just their mentality, they are always going to prioritize winning. And, restructuring Deshaun Watson's deal, some of these other things that they might do coming up, cutting some guys to add some cap space as cap casualties, which we'll talk about. Like, all those things are in the name of let's create enough cap space that we can have some flexibility to do some things and get ourselves back to being a contending team again. And so if that's your goal, great. But in the name of that comes a lot of pressure, because if you fall short next year and you're back in the top 10 drafting again with maybe a 5 or 6 win season, or maybe you're just outside the top 10, that probably costs you your job. Jobs are on the line, I think, going into this next year for both Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski because of how disastrous this season was. If it hadn't been quite as bad, if it had been like, well, you missed the playoffs and you were, 7, if it was 7-9, or I guess 7-9 isn't a thing anymore, but if it was 7-10 or 8-9 and you had just missed the playoffs, and you could kind of point and say like, well, the quarterback injuries and Deshaun struggles early in the year, but we made it close. We made it interesting. It might not be quite as much pressure, but because you went 3-14, like, now the pressure's on, and you can't have, to me, like, my biggest concern was when it was said by Jimmy Haslam that they were bringing everybody back was, okay, so what does that mean for like next year? Like, are they only guaranteeing these guys one more year? Or are they guaranteeing them like a couple more years to figure it out? Because this Deshaun thing is going to be hard to navigate for not just 2025, but 2025, 2026, maybe even beyond, because of the dead cap money that's going to come with it once he's off the books. So, like, if you're only giving him 1 year to figure it out, that basically means, like, you got to nail this draft and you got to turn this thing around really, really quickly from a disastrous season. And that probably starts with the quarterback position, right? And so as I talked yesterday about what I think the Browns are going to do with the number 2 overall pick, which are sitting here today, again, early January, a lot can change. I feel like they're going to end up trading back because they have other needs they need to address, and you can fill a bunch of holes with premium players if you accumulate more picks. And you might even get a pick for next year that allows you to maybe trade back up and get your quarterback in 2026. My problem with that thought process, though, and this is like the dilemma that I've created in my head, is that you can't have this regime might not have both get both those. Basically, what I'm trying to say is this organization might not get to have their cake and eat it too. They might not get to say or punt on, we can go get a quarterback next year because we feel really good about the draft class next year more so than this year. So let's trade back and accumulate picks and we can package something together next year, even if we're assuming we're good. Like, they might only get this year to draft players and get that quarterback and figure that out immediately. And nowadays in the NFL, like, these rookie quarterbacks, you don't let them sit anymore. They don't get the time to sort of like grow and develop and learn behind somebody. Like, it's instant. I mean, again, the Commanders are the perfect example. Jaden Daniels starts, he's off and running. At some point in your first year, generally these rookie quarterbacks are playing. Drake May took over, during the season for the Patriots. He looks like he could be a player. Bo Nix started immediately this year for Denver. So there's countless examples of these rookie quarterbacks. Michael Penix took over for the Falcons late in the year. Like, there's so many examples now of, like, you got to play that guy immediately. So if they're going to take a rookie, they got to know he's the guy and that he's going to be able to play immediately and be the one to turn this thing around. Because if you miss on a quarterback, you're fired anyway. But you also might not get the luxury of waiting on a quarterback to see if next year's class delivers the guy that you're waiting for. So I think this creates this interesting dynamic. I don't know what conversations are like behind the scenes. I'm not trying to suggest that Jimmy Haslam's given the guys an ultimatum and said, like, if you don't win next year and make it back to the playoffs, you're all fired. I think it's kind of a case-by-case basis. They'll see how the season plays out and then make a determination in 2025 during the season what he's going to do with Andrew Berry, Kevin Stefanski, or both. But yeah, like, I do wonder what that means for potentially their thinking at number 2. Because I still believe they'll probably trade back. But if they feel the pressure of, we got to get this quarterback thing figured out, we got to get it right because we missed on Deshaun, we traded Baker, who's out balling now for Tampa Bay. We missed on Deshaun. We haven't been able to identify a quarterback, and that's what a GM is generally defined by. All these GMs, they all get defined by whether or not they find the franchise quarterback or not. And Barry hasn't done that yet. So, like, if he misses, if he can't figure that out and get that figured out quickly, then yeah, like it might be his job on the line. And so does that then force the Browns to take a quarterback at 2, which is a scary prospect because if you take one of these guys and you really they don't fit the system again, much like Deshaun Watson didn't, you set yourself back anyway. And you can set the franchise back years by doing something like that because then the next coaching staff and GM inherit a quarterback that maybe they didn't even like, and that isn't good for the franchise. So there's so much to sort of think about here, but I think the Browns do need to protect themselves, or Andrew Barry more so needs to protect himself from falling into a trap of feeling that pressure of, hey, we might not be here next year, so I got to save my job, so I just got to take a quarterback. You can't just take a quarterback to take a quarterback. It's got to be the right fit, and that is going to be the key conversation leading up to the draft. Which of these quarterbacks would be the right fit? Shedeur Sanders, Cam Ward, maybe somebody else in a later round, and we will talk about those things actually on tomorrow's episode. That's going to be your headliner. Just a tease for tomorrow. Which of the quarterbacks, Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward, is a better fit for the Browns? I'll talk about it with you on Friday's show. In the meantime, this episode is in the books, Dog Pound. Thanks for joining me as always. Talk about your favorite football team as we are in full-fledged offseason mode. There will be plenty more ahead in the weeks and months coming up. And I implore you to continue to make us your first listen every day at the Locked On Browns podcast. For your second listen, go on over and find one of the new Locked On NFL shows, or you can keep it local with the Locked On Cavs or Locked On Guardians podcast. Thanks for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network. I will talk to you again real soon. But for now, Cleveland, I'm out.